I handed my stepmother the $175,000 inheritance check that was meant for my father when he was dying of cancer. 12 years later, I found him alive and working at a gas station in Phoenix. She had faked his death and stolen everything. And that's not even the worst part. Here's how I made sure she lost everything she took from our family. Let me tell you what really happened. Back when I was 28, my life felt pretty good. I had just gotten married to Jake, landed a great job at a marketing firm, and Dad seemed happier than he'd been in years. Dad had married Carol 2 years earlier when I was 26. After Mom died of breast cancer when I was 15, Dad had been alone for over a decade. He threw himself into his construction work and raising me, but I always worried about him being lonely. Carol seemed like exactly what Dad needed. She was 45, beautiful, and had this warm, nurturing way about her. She'd moved to our town from Nevada after her first husband died in a car accident, and she and Dad met at a church social. "Your father deserves someone who appreciates him," she'd tell me, squeezing my hand. "He's such a good man." I was thrilled when they got engaged. Dad was laughing again, taking better care of himself, and seemed genuinely happy for the first time since Mom died. Carol was also incredibly organized, which Dad definitely needed. He'd always been terrible with paperwork and finances. Mom had handled all that before she died, and honestly, Dad was completely lost without her. Bills would stack up, he'd forget to renew insurance, and tax season was always a disaster. But Carol took over all the household management within months of moving in. She'd sit at the kitchen table with neat spreadsheets, paying bills on time and keeping everything organized. "Don't you worry about any of this mess," she'd tell Dad with a sweet smile. "I've got it all under control now." When my grandfather passed away suddenly and left Dad a substantial inheritance of $175,000, Carol immediately stepped in to handle all the complicated legal paperwork. "Your poor father is too emotional about losing his dad," she told me, tears in her eyes. "You know how men are with these things. Let me take care of all the lawyer stuff and probate court nonsense." I thought she was being incredibly thoughtful and supportive. Dad had been very close to Grandpa, and dealing with lawyers seemed overwhelming during his grief. I trusted Carol completely. That trust was about to cost us everything. Everything shifted when Dad got the concerning news. Stage 1 lung cancer. The oncologist said they'd caught it early and the prognosis was very good with surgical removal of the small tumor. I'll never forget that day in the doctor's office. Dad went completely pale and gripped the armrests of his chair. I started crying immediately. But Carol? She went into this strange, eerily calm mode. "What exactly are our treatment options?" she asked the doctor, pulling out a notebook like she was planning a grocery list. The treatment plan was straightforward. Surgery to remove the tumor, followed by monitoring to ensure it didn't return. No chemotherapy or radiation would be needed since they'd caught it so early. "You're very lucky, Mr. Morrison," the oncologist said. "This is exactly the kind of cancer diagnosis you want to hear. We should be able to get all of it with surgery." The operation went perfectly. Dad was in the hospital for what should have been just a few days of recovery, but then he developed a severe case of pneumonia, a secondary infection that sometimes happens after surgery. Within days, Dad was struggling to breathe and running a high fever. The pneumonia was aggressive and wasn't responding well to the first round of antibiotics. He had to be moved to the ICU. Carol was incredible during this period. She stayed at the hospital around the clock, coordinating with doctors and keeping detailed charts of his medications and breathing treatments. She even hired a private nurse to help monitor his oxygen levels when Dad's breathing became severely compromised. "I don't know what we'd do without you," I told her one evening after spending the day at the hospital. "That's what family does," she said, hugging me tight. "We take care of each other." But that's when Dad started asking concerning questions that didn't make sense to me at the time. "Emma, sweetheart," he'd whisper when Carol stepped out of his hospital room. "What happened to Grandpa's inheritance money? Where did that check go?" "Dad, Carol's handling all the financial stuff so you can focus on getting better. Remember?" He'd get this confused, worried expression. "But I need to know where that money—" "Dad, please, the pneumonia and all these medications are making you confused. Carol's taking care of everything just like she promised." I thought I was protecting him from unnecessary stress. I was actually helping her cover up the biggest theft of our lives. The pneumonia dragged on for months. Dad would seem to get better, then relapse with another severe infection. Dad grew weaker and more disoriented. Sometimes he'd ask about bank statements or insurance paperwork, but Carol always had reasonable explanations ready. "The pneumonia and all these strong antibiotics are really affecting his memory and thinking," she'd explained to me privately. "The doctor said this kind of cognitive confusion is completely normal when someone's been this sick for so long." By the fourth month, Dad was barely conscious most days from the severe infections and strong medications. He'd sleep 20 hours straight and could hardly keep food down. The strong, hard-working man who'd raised me was wasting away before my eyes. Then Carol started preparing me for what she said was inevitable. "Honey, I need you to understand that your father is getting much sicker," she said one evening, her voice heavy with sadness. "The pneumonia keeps coming back, and his lungs are so damaged now. The doctors aren't very optimistic anymore about his chances." My heart completely shattered. "What do you mean exactly?" "His immune system is so compromised from fighting these infections for months. They're talking about the possibility that his body just can't fight anymore." I was absolutely devastated. My strong, loving father was dying, and there was nothing I could do to save him. What I didn't know was that Carol had already begun planning his fake death. The phone call that changed everything came on a gray Tuesday morning in March. I was at my desk at the marketing firm when my cell phone rang with Carol's number. "Emma?" Her voice was shaking and barely audible. "Carol? What's happening?" "You need to come to the hospital immediately. It's your father." My blood turned to ice. "What happened? Is he okay?" "He's gone, honey. He passed away about an hour ago." The phone slipped right out of my hands and clattered onto my desk. I remember my coworker Sarah catching me as my knees completely buckled. The entire world tilted sideways, and I couldn't catch my breath. I somehow managed to drive to the hospital, though I was shaking so violently I could barely control the steering wheel. This couldn't be real. Dad was supposed to fight longer. We were supposed to have more time together. When I arrived, Carol was sitting in the family waiting room crying into a pile of tissues. Her eyes were completely red and swollen, and she looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour. "I'm so sorry, Emma," she whispered, pulling me into a crushing hug. "He went very peacefully. I was holding his hand when it happened." "Can I see him?" I managed to ask through my tears. Carol's face crumpled with fresh grief. "Oh, sweetheart, they've already moved him to prepare. It's better if you remember him the way he was when he was healthy and strong." I was so completely destroyed by grief that I didn't question anything. Carol seemed to know exactly what needed to be done, and I was just a 28-year-old who'd never dealt with death before. "What do we do now?" I asked helplessly. "Leave everything to me," Carol said firmly, squeezing my hands. "I'll handle all the funeral arrangements and paperwork. You just focus on saying goodbye to your father." I should have demanded to see his body. I should have asked 100 questions. But grief makes you stupid and trusting, and Carol was counting on exactly that. The funeral took place 3 days later at Hillside Memorial Chapel. It was a small, simple service with just me, Carol, and about 8 of Dad's coworkers from the construction company. Carol had arranged everything: the casket, the flowers, even the music. He would have wanted something understated, she told me, nothing too fancy or expensive. I stood there in my black dress, watching them lower Dad's mahogany casket into the ground, feeling like my entire world was ending. Carol stood right beside me, crying just as hard as I was. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. After the graveside service, Carol pulled me aside privately. "Emma, I've been thinking about this a lot," she said carefully. "I know this might sound strange, but I think I need to move away from here. There are just too many painful memories in this house." "Move away? But where would you go?" "I have a sister in Florida who's been asking me to come stay with her. Maybe a fresh start would be healthy for both of us." I was still numb from grief. "What about Dad's belongings? All his tools and things?" "I'll take care of sorting through everything. You just focus on healing and getting back to your normal life with Jake." Within just 3 weeks, Carol had sold Dad's house, packed up all of his possessions, and moved to Fort Lauderdale. She left me with a small savings account containing $8,000 for any expenses and promised we'd stay in close touch. "This is just as difficult for me as it is for you," she said, giving me a long goodbye hug, "but your father would want both of us to move forward and build happy lives." What I didn't realize was that she'd just executed the perfect crime and was disappearing with all the evidence. The years crawled by slowly and painfully. I tried to rebuild my life, but the grief felt like a heavy weight I carried everywhere. Jake was incredibly patient and supportive, but there was always this gaping hole where Dad should have been. I visited Dad's grave every single year on his birthday and on the anniversary of his death. I'd bring fresh flowers, usually the yellow roses he'd loved, and sit cross-legged in the grass talking to his headstone like he could somehow hear me. "I got a promotion at work, Dad," I'd say, tracing his name carved in the granite. "I wish you could see how well Jake and I are doing." Carol and I exchanged Christmas cards for the first couple of years, then gradually lost touch completely. Her cards always said the same generic things. "Hope you're doing well. Thinking of you during the holidays. Love, Carol." By the third year, even the Christmas cards stopped coming entirely. Jake and I had our first child when I was 31, a beautiful daughter we named Grace. 2 years later, we had a son, Michael. I'd tell them stories about the grandfather they'd never get to meet. Grandpa was strong and funny and could build anything with his hands, I'd say, showing them the few old photographs I had. He would have absolutely loved both of you. But there was always this terrible, aching emptiness where Dad should have been. He'd missed my 30th birthday, the births of his grandchildren, every Christmas morning, every important milestone of my adult life. I tried looking for Carol online a few times over the years, especially around the holidays when the loneliness felt particularly sharp, but she seemed to have completely disappeared from social media, and my searches never turned up anything useful. I thought I was processing grief normally and learning to live without him. I had no idea I was mourning a man who was actually alive and thinking about me every single day. 12 years after Dad's supposed death, my marketing company sent me to Phoenix for a 3-day conference on digital advertising trends. I'd never been to Arizona before, and honestly, I wasn't particularly excited about the trip. My flight was delayed for 2 hours, and I didn't get to my hotel until almost midnight. The next morning, I was running late for the first conference session when I realized my rental car was nearly empty on gas. I pulled into the first station I saw, a rundown Shell station on the outskirts of town. The kind of place with flickering neon signs, cracked pavement, and bars on the windows. An older man in a faded blue work uniform came out to help me pump gas. He was thin, probably in his early 60s, with graying hair and deeply weathered hands. "Fill it up for you today?" he asked in a voice that made my heart completely stop. I looked up from my phone and the entire world seemed to tilt off its axis. It was my father. Not someone who looked similar to my father. Not a man with comparable features. It was Dad, 12 years older, much thinner, with more gray hair, but unmistakably him. Same green eyes, same crooked smile, same distinctive scar on his left hand from a construction accident when I was in high school. "Dad?" The word barely came out as a whisper. He looked at me more carefully, and I watched complete recognition slowly dawn across his face. His eyes went wide with shock, then immediately filled with tears. "Emma? Oh my God, Emma, is that really you?" He dropped the gas nozzle and rushed around the car toward me. We collided in the middle of that grimy gas station parking lot, both of us sobbing and shaking uncontrollably. "I can't believe you're here," he cried, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I've missed you so much, baby girl. So much." My supposedly dead father was alive and pumping gas in Arizona. My brain couldn't process what was happening. "Dad, you're supposed to be dead," I said through my tears. "I went to your funeral. I watched them bury your coffin." His face went dark with confusion and something that looked like anger. "What funeral? Emma, what are you talking about?" And that's when my entire world started unraveling. We went inside the gas station office where his manager, a kind older man named Miguel, gave us complete privacy to talk and catch up. "Start from the very beginning," I said, still trembling. "Tell me exactly what happened after the hospital." Dad's version of events made my blood pressure skyrocket with pure rage. He had been in the hospital recovering from lung surgery and fighting severe pneumonia, yes, but he wasn't dying at all. The cancer had been completely removed with surgery, and the pneumonia, while serious, was finally responding to treatment. His lungs were healing, and his doctor was genuinely optimistic about his full recovery. "I was getting stronger every day once they found the right antibiotics," Dad explained. "The pneumonia was clearing up, and the surgeon said the cancer operation had been completely successful. They'd gotten everything." Then what the hell happened? Carol started acting very strange around that time. She'd have these long, private conversations with my doctors and nurses that I wasn't included in. She got some kind of legal paperwork that made her my healthcare proxy and financial guardian. Dad went on to explain that Carol had somehow convinced the entire medical staff that the severe pneumonia and strong medications were severely affecting his mental capacity and decision-making abilities. She'd presented them with official-looking documents that gave her complete authority to make all healthcare and financial decisions on his behalf. She told everyone I was becoming paranoid and delusional, Dad said, his voice getting angry. She said the lung infections and all the antibiotics had affected my brain, and I was making wild accusations about money being stolen and couldn't be trusted to make rational choices about my own care. The most horrible part was what happened when Dad was finally discharged from the hospital after his lungs had healed and the pneumonia was gone. Carol didn't drive me home, Emma, Dad said. She drove me to some kind of assisted living facility here in Phoenix, told me it was just temporary while I recovered my strength. Why didn't you call me immediately? Dad's face completely crumpled with pain. I tried calling you so many times, sweetheart, but Carol said you didn't want to see me anymore. She said you'd told her that having a sick father was embarrassing, and you wanted to move on with your life. I felt like I was going to be physically sick. The level of manipulation was breathtaking. She said you were ashamed of me being weak and sick, Dad continued, his voice breaking. That you'd started a new life with Jake and didn't want your old, sick father holding you back. Dad, that's completely insane. I would never, ever say anything like that. I know that now, obviously, but I was so weak and confused from all the medications they'd given me for the pneumonia, and Carol showed me text messages and emails that seemed to come from your phone number, saying you never wanted to see me again, and that I was just a burden you didn't need. My hands were literally shaking with fury. Carol had somehow spoofed my phone number or created fake messages to convince Dad that I'd completely abandoned him during his illness. What about your friends from work? Your construction crew? Didn't anyone try to find you or ask questions? Dad's voice got smaller and sadder. Carol told all of them that I'd moved to Arizona to be closer to you and your new family. She even sent a few of them fake postcards, supposedly from me, saying I was doing great in my new city and loving retirement. The scope of Carol's planning and deception was absolutely staggering. She'd thought of every possible detail. And the inheritance money, Dad? The $175,000 from Grandpa? Dad's expression turned hard and bitter. Gone, every single penny. Carol had gotten herself added to all my bank accounts when I was too sick to think clearly. She said it was to help pay for medical bills and expenses. So she just stole everything? All of it. The inheritance, plus she cashed out my life insurance policy and cleaned out my entire savings account. She left me at that assisted living place with literally nothing except the clothes on my back. I was seeing red, actually seeing red around the edges of my vision. I felt like I might pass out from the pure intensity of my rage. Dad, I thought you were dead for 12 years. I mourned you. I visited your grave every year on your birthday. What grave? Who's buried there? That's when I realized the full, horrifying scope of Carol's elaborate scheme. She'd somehow arranged for an empty casket to be buried, or possibly even used an unclaimed body from the morgue. She'd forged death certificates, collected life insurance payouts, and vanished with everything Dad owned. I wasn't going to let this stand. Not for one more day. I immediately canceled the rest of my conference and spent the next 3 days with Dad, getting every detail of his story and planning our revenge. Here's what Carol didn't know about me. My husband Jake worked for the FBI's white-collar crime division. My best friend Sarah from college was now a successful lawyer specializing in elder abuse and fraud cases. And I had 12 years of pent-up grief that was about to transform into pure, focused anger. When I called Jake and explained what had happened, he was quiet for a long moment. Emma, this is serious federal crime territory, he said finally. We're talking about identity theft, mail fraud, insurance fraud, bank fraud, and elder abuse. This woman is looking at decades in prison. Sarah was even more outraged when I told her the complete story. This is the most elaborate elder abuse case I've ever heard of, she said. But the good news is that means we have her on multiple felony charges across state lines. We spent the next week methodically gathering evidence. Dad still had some of his medical records from the Phoenix Care Facility. We obtained copies of the fraudulent death certificate Carol had filed. Jake used his FBI resources to pull financial records showing the inheritance money being transferred to accounts in Carol's name only. But our smoking gun came from an unexpected source. Miguel, Dad's manager at the gas station, had become like a surrogate father to Dad over the past 7 years. Dad had told him the whole story about his ungrateful daughter who didn't want him anymore. "I never believed that story for 1 second," Miguel told me. "A man doesn't talk about his daughter the way your father talks about you if she really doesn't love him. He talks about you every single day." Miguel had actually encouraged Dad to try contacting me several times over the years, but Dad was too afraid of being rejected again. All the pieces were falling into place perfectly. Now it was time to destroy Carol. Finding Carol's current location took some detective work, but Jake had access to law enforcement databases. She was living in a luxury waterfront condo in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, under the name Carol Morrison Stevens. "Emma, you need to sit down for this next part," Jake said when he called with more information. "What did you find?" Carol got married again 18 months ago, to a 74-year-old retired businessman named Harold Stevens. My stomach dropped. Please tell me he's not dead. "He's alive, but here's the concerning part. He just changed his will 3 months ago to leave everything to Carol. We're talking about a $1.8 million estate. This wasn't just about Dad anymore. Carol was clearly a predator who specifically targeted vulnerable older men, and she was about to do it again." Sarah ran a more detailed background check on Carol's history. What she found was a clear pattern, but thankfully not as extreme as I'd initially feared. "She's been married 3 times before your father," Sarah told me. 2 of those marriages ended in divorce where she got substantial settlements. The 3rd husband died of natural causes, but only after she'd gained control of his finances. Dad was supposed to be her next big score, but when his cancer treatment actually worked, and he didn't die on schedule, Carol had to improvise with the fake death scheme. She'd stolen his identity, his money, and 12 years of our lives together. "We're going to nail her to the wall," Jake promised, "but we need to be strategic about this approach." The plan was straightforward but needed to be executed perfectly. Jake would coordinate with FBI agents in Florida. Sarah would prepare all the legal paperwork for multiple felony charges, and I was going to be the one to confront Carol face to face. But first, I wanted her to see Dad alive and realize her perfect crime was falling apart. I wanted to watch her face when her world completely collapsed. Carol was living in a beautiful waterfront condo in an upscale area of Fort Lauderdale. The building had marble floors, gold fixtures, and a doorman, clearly the kind of place that screamed stolen money. I didn't call ahead or give any warning. I just showed up at her door on a Thursday afternoon with Dad standing slightly behind me. When Carol opened the door and saw me, her face went through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, confusion, fear, and then this obviously fake smile. "Emma, oh my goodness, what an incredible surprise! What brings you all the way to Florida?" She looked fantastic, I had to admit. Expensive clothes, professional makeup, jewelry that probably cost more than my annual salary. The $175,000 she'd stolen from Dad had clearly been invested wisely in her appearance and lifestyle. "I came to introduce you to someone special," I said with a sweet smile. "Oh? Who would that?" I stepped aside and Dad moved into full view. Carol's face went completely white, like every drop of blood drained out of her head instantly. She actually grabbed the doorframe to keep from collapsing. "Hello, Carol," Dad said calmly. "Surprise, I'm not actually dead." For a full 15 seconds, Carol just stared at him like she was seeing an actual ghost, which, from her perspective, she basically was. "That's impossible," she whispered. "What's impossible?" I asked innocently. "That my father didn't die 12 years ago? That you lied about his death and stole his inheritance money?" Carol's initial shock quickly transformed into anger. Classic narcissist behavior, when caught red-handed, immediately go on the attack. "I don't know what kind of sick scam you two are trying to pull," she snapped, "but I'm calling the police right now." "That's an excellent idea," Jake said, stepping out from behind a pillar where he'd been waiting. "I'm Special Agent Jake Morrison with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Carol Morrison, you're under arrest for multiple counts of fraud." The expression on Carol's face was absolutely priceless, pure terror mixed with complete disbelief. "This is harassment," she said, but her voice was shaking badly. "You can't prove anything." I smiled and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "Actually, Carol, we can prove everything." Jake read Carol her Miranda rights while she stood there in her expensive designer outfit, finally understanding that her elaborate scheme was completely falling apart. "You have the right to remain silent," Jake said professionally, pulling out handcuffs. "Wait," Carol said, panic creeping into her voice. "You don't understand the situation. Your father was seriously ill. I was trying to protect him and help with his medical care." Dad stepped forward and his voice was ice cold. "Protect me? You stole my inheritance, faked my death, and abandoned me homeless in a city where I knew absolutely no one. You were confused and disoriented from the chemotherapy treatments." "I was getting better." Dad's voice rose with anger. "The doctors said the cancer treatment was working perfectly, but you couldn't wait for me to actually die naturally, could you?" Carol's carefully maintained facade finally cracked completely. "You have no idea what I sacrificed taking care of ungrateful men like you." There it was, the real Carol, entitled, bitter, and completely without any remorse. "Ungrateful?" I stepped closer to her. "My father worked construction for 35 years to provide for his family. He loved you, trusted you completely, and you repaid him by stealing everything he had and making his daughter think he was dead. He was weak and pathetic," Carol spat, showing her true colors, "just like all the others." Jake and I exchanged meaningful glances. She was confessing to everything and implicating herself in other potential crimes. "What others, Carol?" Jake asked, still recording everything. Carol realized her mistake too late. Her face went pale again. "I want a lawyer," she said quietly. "That's your right," Jake said, clicking the handcuffs into place. "But it's too late to take back what you just admitted." As they led Carol away in handcuffs, she looked back at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "You have no idea who you're messing with," she hissed. "Actually," I said calmly, "I know exactly who I'm messing with. A pathetic predator who steals from people who trusted her, and now everyone is going to know what you really are." That was a promise I fully intended to keep. But I wasn't finished yet. Carol's arrest was just the beginning of her downfall. While she sat in jail awaiting trial, I made sure the entire world knew exactly what she'd done to our family. I wrote a detailed blog post about the whole experience, complete with copies of court documents, medical records, and a timeline of Carol's crimes. I posted it on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and every social media platform I could think of. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, my post had been shared over 10,000 times. Local news outlets picked up the story. I started getting interview requests from TV stations and newspapers. But the most satisfying part was when Carol's current husband, Harold, reached out to me. "I saw your story online," he said when he called. "I think I need to talk to you about Carol." Harold had started noticing some concerning patterns in Carol's behavior. She'd been pushing him to update his will, asking detailed questions about his finances, and had recently suggested he might benefit from a memory evaluation with a doctor she'd recommended. "After reading your story, I realize she's been setting up the same scam with me," Harold said. "Thank God you found your father when you did." Harold immediately changed his will, removed Carol from all his accounts, and filed for divorce. He also provided us with additional evidence of Carol's fraudulent activities. During the investigation, authorities discovered that Carol had been part of a small network of women who specifically targeted lonely older men through church groups and dating websites. They weren't sophisticated criminals, just opportunistic predators who moved from victim to victim. But Carol had been the most successful of the group because she was willing to go to extremes like faking deaths and forging official documents. Her greed and overconfidence had finally caught up with her. Carol's trial took place 8 months later, and I attended every single day. I wanted her to see Dad's face and remember what she'd stolen from our family. The prosecutor called it one of the most heartless fraud cases he'd ever seen. "The defendant didn't just steal money," he told the jury. "She stole a daughter's father and a father's daughter. She destroyed a family and left both victims believing the other had abandoned them." I testified for over 2 hours about the impact of Carol's crimes. About 12 years of grieving a father who was actually alive and struggling to survive, about missed birthdays, holidays, and milestones that could never be recovered. "She didn't just steal $175,000, I told the jury, looking directly at Carol. "She stole 12 years of my father's life and 12 years of my life. She stole my children's chance to know their grandfather during their early years." Carol's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd genuinely been trying to help Dad with his medical expenses and that faking his death was a tragic misunderstanding. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, testimony from medical staff who remembered her lies. Everything painted a clear picture of calculated fraud. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before finding Carol guilty on all charges: identity theft, insurance fraud, mail fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Judge Martinez sentenced Carol to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. "Mrs. Morrison," the judge said, "your crimes represent a level of calculated cruelty that this court rarely encounters. You systematically destroyed a family for personal financial gain, showing no regard for the devastating emotional damage you caused." Carol was also ordered to pay back every penny she'd stolen from Dad, plus interest and punitive damages totaling nearly $400,000, from luxury waterfront condo to federal prison cell. Carol got exactly what she deserved. 3 years later, Dad walked me down the aisle at my vow renewal ceremony with Jake. We'd decided to celebrate our 10th anniversary by renewing our vows, and having Dad there made it incredibly special. "I never thought I'd get to do this," he whispered as we walked down the aisle. "Dad, you've got at least 20 more years of grandfather duties ahead of you," I whispered back. Dad had moved into a house just 4 blocks from us, and now Grace and Michael see their grandfather almost every day. He teaches them how to fish, helps them with homework, and tells them stories about their grandmother they never got to meet. "Grandpa, tell us about the gas station story again," Grace always requests. "Well," Dad says with a grin, "did I ever tell you about the day Mommy saved my life by stopping for gas?" Carol sends occasional letters from prison claiming she's found religion and asking for forgiveness. Dad throws them away without reading them. "Some things can't be forgiven," he says simply. Harold, Carol's ex-husband, became an unexpected friend. He visits us every few months and has become like an honorary grandfather to my kids. We use some of the restitution money to start a small foundation that helps families who've been separated by financial fraud. We've helped reunite 6 families so far, with relatives they thought were dead or missing. Sometimes I think about how different our lives would have been if I'd chosen a different gas station that day, or if I'd been too rushed to stop for fuel. Dad and I might never have found each other again, but we did find each other, and Carol's supposedly perfect crime became the biggest mistake of her life. She thought she was so clever, stealing from a grieving family and disappearing without a trace, but she underestimated the bond between a father and daughter. That underestimation cost her everything: her freedom, her stolen fortune, and 15 years of her life rotting in a federal prison. Meanwhile, Dad and I got back something infinitely more valuable: each other, and all the time we have left to make up for what she stole. If you enjoyed seeing Carol get exactly what she deserved, you'll love the story that's just popped up on the screen. But before you watch that, please leave a comment about this story or let us know if you've ever experienced anything similar. Also, please remember to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks.